You know, folks, pull up a chair. We need to talk about something that happened in a courthouse in Virginia that most people missed while they were checking their phones or watching the game. Something that matters more than the headlines make it sound. Because what went down in that courtroom isn't just about one prosecutor or one case or one former FBI director. It's about how the whole system works when somebody decides the rules don't apply to them anymore. Alexandria, Virginia, Federal Courthouse, Northern District, Judge William Fitzpatrick presiding, 23 years on the bench, the kind of judge who reads every word of every filing, who remembers precedents from cases 30 years old, who asks questions that make lawyers sweat even when they've done nothing wrong. Today he's got a case in front of him that involves James Comey, the former FBI director. You remember Comey, 6'8", used to run the bureau until Trump fired him back in 2017. Now, he's charged with lying to Congress, obstruction, leaking classified information, the works. The prosecutor standing at that podium is Lindsay Halligan, new to this case. Installed after the previous prosecutors, the career guys who'd been doing this work for decades, got removed. Nobody said why they got removed. Nobody had to. Everyone knew. They weren't moving fast enough. They weren't delivering what the boss wanted. Now, I've been watching how investigations work for more decades than I care to count. I've seen prosecutors build cases the right way, slowly, carefully, checking every fact twice, making sure the evidence holds up. And I've seen prosecutors who let ambition or pressure or fear push them into cutting corners. The first kind sleep well at night. The second kind end up in hearings like this one. Judge Fitzpatrick asked a question. Simple question, direct. The kind that shouldn't cause any problem if everything's been done properly. He wanted to know about the grand jury process, how the indictment came about, what the grand jurors saw, what they voted on. Less than 1 minute. That's how long it took for Lindsay Halligan to say something that turned that courtroom into chaos. She admitted that the final indictment, the actual charges James Comey now faces, were never shown to the full grand jury. The grand jury never approved them in full. In fact, the grand jury had been asked to approve 3 different charges. They voted no. They declined to indict. And then, somehow, without going back to that grand jury, without getting their approval, an indictment appeared anyway. Let me tell you something about grand juries. They're supposed to be a protection. A group of regular citizens who stand between the government's power to prosecute and the individual's right not to be harassed by bogus charges. The grand jury sees the evidence, hears the witnesses, and decides whether there's enough there to proceed. If they say no, that's supposed to be the end of it. You don't get to shop around for a different answer. You don't get to write up charges they never approved and pretend it's legitimate. But that's what happened here. The grand jury said no, and the indictment happened anyway. Now, when Judge Fitzpatrick heard this, you could feel the temperature in that room drop about 20 degrees. Because what Halligan just admitted isn't a paperwork error. It's not some technical mistake that can be fixed with an amended filing. What she admitted is that the entire foundation of this prosecution is built on sand, or worse, built on something that was never supposed to exist. The judge didn't yell. Judges rarely do. But he used words that land harder than shouting. Disturbing pattern, profound investigative missteps. Those aren't phrases judges toss around when they're mildly concerned. Those are phrases that mean somebody's about to lose their case, their credibility, maybe their career. He ordered full disclosure. Everything. The complete grand jury transcript. All the evidence, all the communications, everything the prosecution has been holding gets turned over to Comey's defense team. That's extraordinary. Grand jury proceedings are secret. Defendants normally get limited access, just enough to defend themselves. But when a judge orders complete disclosure, he's saying the government's misconduct is so severe that normal rules don't protect it anymore. And he warned that this could result in dismissal of all charges, not just some technical do-over where they fix the problems and try again. Dismissal for prosecutorial abuse, which means Comey walks free and the charges can never be brought again. And the people who brought those charges face consequences of their own. Now let's talk about how this prosecution came to be. Because the timeline tells you everything you need to know about what's really happening here. Donald Trump, back in office for his second term, has made it clear from day one that he's got scores to settle. Long list of people he believes wronged him. James Comey's near the top of that list. Comey ran the Russia investigation. Comey wouldn't pledge loyalty. Comey testified before Congress about conversations with Trump that made the president look bad. Trump fired him. But firing wasn't enough. Trump wanted prosecution. He wanted Comey in handcuffs. So Trump starts posting on Truth Social, demanding action, demanding that his Justice Department go after Comey, lock him up, the usual rhetoric. But this time he's got the power to make it happen. He's got control of the Justice Department. He can install people who'll do what he wants. The career prosecutors working on reviewing Comey's conduct, they apparently had concerns. Maybe they didn't think the evidence supported charges. Maybe they thought it looked too political. Maybe they just wanted to do things by the book, carefully, properly, the way you're supposed to build a case that'll hold up in court. Those prosecutors got removed, just gone, replaced. Lindsay Halligan comes in, new prosecutor, willing to move fast. And suddenly there's an emergency push for an indictment. Emergency. As if James Comey, a man who's been out of government for years, who's been writing books and giving speeches, suddenly poses some urgent threat that requires immediate action. The grand jury gets called, evidence gets presented, and the grand jury says no. 3 proposed charges, no on all of them. That should be the end of the story. Except it wasn't. Because somehow, an indictment appears anyway. Different charges than what the grand jury saw. No approval from the grand jury. Just filed. Just done. And James Comey gets arrested. You see the pattern. Trump demands prosecution. Career prosecutors resist. They get removed. New prosecutor comes in, rushes the process. Grand jury refuses to indict. Indictment happens anyway. That's not how justice works. That's how revenge works. Now, I've been investing in American businesses for more than 80 years. And I'll tell you, the health of those businesses, the value of those investments, all of it depends on one thing more than anything else: rule of law. The belief that the system works fairly, that contracts mean something, that courts enforce rules consistently, that power doesn't trump principle. When that belief starts to erode, everything else starts to wobble. Markets can handle bad news. They can handle recessions, inflation, wars, scandals. What they can't handle is uncertainty about whether the rules still apply. When investors start wondering if the legal system is just a tool for whoever's in power to crush their enemies, that's when capital gets nervous. That's when money starts looking for safer places to live. This case, this hearing, this judicial eruption, as some are calling it, it matters beyond James Comey. It matters because it's testing whether our institutions can still hold up when political pressure tries to bend them. Judge Fitzpatrick just showed that at least one part of the system is still working. One judge willing to call out misconduct even when it means defying the president who appointed the prosecutor, even when it means facing attacks on Truth Social, even when it means standing alone. Because Trump's response to this ruling was exactly what you'd expect. He didn't say, let's review what went wrong and fix it. He didn't say, if there was misconduct, we need to hold people accountable. He attacked the judge, called the ruling part of a conspiracy, said Judge Fitzpatrick is protecting the deep state, called his own prosecutors traitors for getting caught doing shoddy work. Think about that. The President of the United States calling a federal judge corrupt for exposing prosecutorial misconduct, calling his own Justice Department prosecutors traitors because they got caught breaking the rules while trying to prosecute his enemy. That's not leadership. That's panic. Let me walk you through what Judge Fitzpatrick found. Because the details matter. This isn't abstract legal theory. This is concrete, specific wrongdoing that got documented in court filings. First, fundamental misstatements of law. That means the prosecutors either didn't understand basic criminal law, which would be stunning for federal prosecutors, or they deliberately misstated it to deceive the grand jury. When you're presenting a case to a grand jury, you're supposed to explain the law accurately. You're supposed to give them the tools to make an informed decision. If you're lying about what the law says, or even just getting it badly wrong, you're corrupting the entire process. Second, missing sections of grand jury transcripts. Grand jury proceedings are recorded meticulously. Everything that's said in that room gets transcribed and preserved. It's part of the record. It protects everyone. Protects the defendant from false accusations about what evidence was presented. Protects the prosecution from false accusations about what they said. Protects the grand jurors from pressure or misrepresentation of their decisions. Sections of the transcript in this case are missing, just gone. Now, transcripts don't disappear by accident. Someone has to remove them. Someone has to make sure they're not in the file that gets turned over. The fact that portions of this transcript are absent suggests that something happened in that grand jury room that the prosecution doesn't want anyone to see. Maybe evidence that contradicted the charges. Maybe prosecutorial statements that crossed ethical lines. Maybe grand juror questions that exposed weaknesses in the case. Whatever's in those missing sections, it was apparently damaging enough that someone decided it needed to vanish. Third, and this is perhaps the most egregious, the illegal use of protected attorney-client communications. This is sacred ground in our legal system. When you talk to your lawyer, those conversations are privileged. They're protected. The government can't use them against you. That protection exists because you need to be able to be completely honest with your attorney. Tell them everything, even things that might look bad, so they can defend you properly. If that privilege gets violated, the whole system breaks down. Nobody can get a fair defense if their private conversations with their lawyer can be used as evidence against them. The prosecutors in this case used attorney-client communications. They took privileged material and put it in front of the grand jury. That's not just misconduct. That's potentially criminal behavior by the prosecutors themselves. Lawyers can be disbarred for that. Prosecutors can face charges for violating constitutional rights. So you've got prosecutors who misstate the law, hide evidence, violate privilege, and then push through an indictment that the grand jury never approved. That's not a case. That's a frame job. Now, Trump wants you to believe that Judge Fitzpatrick is part of some deep state conspiracy to protect Comey. But look at what's actually happening. The judge isn't protecting anyone. He's exposing everything. He's ordering full disclosure of all the misconduct. He's threatening to dismiss the case and sanction the prosecutors. If he were trying to protect Comey as part of some conspiracy, he'd do it quietly. He'd find some procedural reason to slow things down, delay, maybe suggest the prosecutors could fix their problems and try again. Instead, he's documenting everything in detail, creating a record, making sure everyone can see exactly what went wrong. The real cover-up here was the prosecution's attempt to hide their misconduct, hiding grand jury transcripts, using privileged communications, misrepresenting the law, getting an indictment without grand jury approval. All of that is cover-up. They were trying to cover up the weakness of their case, the political nature of the prosecution, the corners they cut to please the boss. Judge Fitzpatrick isn't covering anything up. He's pulling back the curtain. Let me tell you what this means for the economy, because political chaos doesn't stay in Washington. It seeps into everything. When you've got a president using the Justice Department to prosecute enemies, when you've got prosecutors willing to break rules to deliver what the boss wants, when you've got courts having to step in to stop blatant misconduct, that creates uncertainty. And uncertainty is expensive. Businesses planning long-term investments start wondering if the rules will be the same in 5 years. Foreign investors start wondering if the United States is still a reliable place to park capital. Credit markets start pricing in political risk. None of this happens overnight. It's subtle. A basis point here, a delayed project there. But it compounds. Over time, institutional rot becomes economic drag. I've lived through a lot of political storms. Watergate, Iran-Contra, impeachments, financial crises. Every time, people said this is different, this time it's really bad, maybe we won't recover. And every time, we did recover. Because the institutions held, the courts did their job. The rule of law meant something. That's what's being tested right now. And Judge Fitzpatrick just showed that at least some parts of the system are still strong enough to push back. But one judge can't hold back corruption alone. This has to be the start of broader accountability, not an exception. Let's talk about what happens next, because this case isn't over. Comey's lawyers will get all that evidence, all those transcripts, all the communications that show how this prosecution really came together. They'll file motions. They'll document every piece of misconduct in detail. They'll argue for dismissal. And based on what Judge Fitzpatrick has already said, based on the language he used, based on his order for full disclosure, dismissal looks likely. If the case gets dismissed for prosecutorial misconduct, that's a complete vindication for Comey. It means he was right all along when he said this was political revenge. It means the government couldn't build a legitimate case even when they were willing to break the rules trying. And it opens up the prosecutors, maybe even people higher up who directed this prosecution, to consequences of their own. Lindsay Halligan's career is probably over. Even if she doesn't face criminal charges, even if she doesn't get disbarred, her reputation is destroyed. She'll be known forever as the prosecutor who cut corners, violated privileges, hid evidence, and got caught. No reputable law firm will hire her. No judge will trust her. She bet her career on pleasing Trump, and she's about to find out that Trump doesn't protect people who fail him. The broader implications go beyond this case. Every other political prosecution Trump has directed or influenced is now suspect. Defense lawyers in those cases will point to what happened with Comey and say, if they did this in the highest profile case, what did they do in mine? Every motion to dismiss will cite Judge Fitzpatrick's ruling. Every claim of prosecutorial misconduct will have this case as precedent. Trump wanted to use the Justice Department as a weapon. He wanted to prove that his enemies would face consequences. Instead, he's proven that his prosecutors will break the law, that his Justice Department can't be trusted, that courts have to step in to protect defendants from government abuse. That's the opposite of the message he wanted to send. Now, some folks will say this is all partisan, that I'm being too hard on Trump, that Democrats did similar things, that everyone in Washington plays these games. And I'll tell you what I've told people for decades. I don't care about party. I care about principles. If a Democratic president had done this, had pressured prosecutors to indict an enemy, had installed loyalists who cut corners and violated rules, I'd say the same thing. Wrong is wrong, regardless of who's doing it. But we're not talking about hypothetical Democrats. We're talking about what actually happened. Trump demanded prosecution. Career prosecutors resisted. They got removed. A new prosecutor rushed an indictment. The grand jury said no. The indictment happened anyway. A judge caught it and exposed it. Those are facts. They're not partisan. They're documented. They happened. The question isn't whether you like Trump or hate him. The question is whether you think presidents should be able to direct prosecutions of their enemies, whether you think prosecutors should be allowed to cut corners and break rules when the boss demands results, whether you think courts should let that kind of misconduct slide or call it out. I know what I think, and I think most Americans, regardless of their politics, would agree if they looked at the facts without the partisan noise. Nobody wants to live in a country where the justice system is just a weapon for whoever's in power. Nobody benefits from that kind of corruption except the corrupt. Let me tell you something about power. I've watched a lot of powerful people over the years, CEOs, politicians, investors, people who commanded billions of dollars or millions of votes. And the ones who lasted, who built something that endured, were the ones who understood that power is a responsibility, not a right. You're a steward. You're holding something that existed before you and should exist after you're gone. Your job is to protect it, strengthen it, pass it on better than you found it. The ones who treated power as a tool for personal revenge, who used their position to settle scores and crush enemies, they didn't last. They burned bright and fast and left nothing but wreckage. Because systems built on fear and revenge can't sustain themselves. Eventually, the fear turns on the person creating it. Eventually, the revenge cycle comes back around. Trump has enormous power right now. Control of the Justice Department, control of federal law enforcement, the ability to appoint prosecutors and judges, the ability to direct investigations. That's real power. The question is what he does with it. Does he use it to strengthen the rule of law, to ensure justice is done fairly and consistently? Or does he use it to punish enemies and reward friends? This case gives us the answer. And the answer is troubling. But here's the thing that gives me hope. The system pushed back. One judge said no. One judge looked at the misconduct and refused to let it slide. One judge created a record that will protect the next defendant and the one after that. That's how institutions survive. Not because they're perfect, not because corruption never happens, but because somewhere in the system, someone with authority says no. Someone draws a line. Someone enforces the rules even when it's uncomfortable. Judge Fitzpatrick drew that line. Now we'll see if others follow. The economic consequences of all this will take time to manifest. You won't see it in tomorrow's stock prices. You won't see it in next quarter's GDP. But over months and years, this kind of institutional stress shows up. It shows up in the cost of borrowing, in the decisions foreign investors make about where to put capital, in the way businesses plan for the long term, in the confidence ordinary people have in their futures. Trust is like compound interest. It builds slowly, a little bit each year, accumulating, growing stronger. But it can be destroyed quickly. A few bad decisions, a few visible instances of corruption that don't get punished, a few times where the powerful get away with things that would land anyone else in prison. That destroys trust faster than you can imagine. And once trust is gone, rebuilding it takes decades. Just ask any company that lost customer trust through scandal. Just ask any country that let corruption become normal. The road back is long and expensive, and some never make it. That's what's at stake here. Not just James Comey's freedom, not just one political prosecution, the trust that makes everything else possible. The belief that America is still a place where rules matter more than power, where justice isn't just a word but a real thing that applies to everyone equally. I've bet on America my entire life. Every investment I've made, every business I've built, every dollar I've earned has been a bet that this country's institutions are strong enough to outlast individual leaders, that the Constitution means something, that courts will enforce the law, that eventually truth matters more than spin. I'm not stopping that bet now, but I'm watching carefully. Because this moment, this case, this judicial response to prosecutorial misconduct, it's a test. Maybe the most important test we've faced in a long time. If accountability holds, if consequences follow misconduct, if courts continue to protect defendants from government abuse, then the system works. It might be stressed, it might be tested, but it works. And if it works, the economy will reflect that. Confidence will stabilize. Investment will continue. America will remain the safest place in the world to build wealth and pursue opportunity. But if accountability fails, if misconduct gets excused or ignored, if courts start letting political pressure override legal principle, then we've got a different problem. A problem that can't be solved with monetary policy or fiscal stimulus. A problem that goes to the core of what makes this country function. So I'm watching Judge Fitzpatrick's courtroom. I'm watching how this case unfolds. I'm watching whether other judges follow his example. I'm watching whether the Justice Department cleans house or doubles down. I'm watching whether Congress exercises oversight or stays silent. I'm watching whether voters care more about partisan victory than institutional integrity. Those things will tell me more about America's economic future than any jobs report or inflation number. Because the economy isn't separate from democracy. It's built on top of democracy. You can't have sustainable prosperity without rule of law. You can't have rule of law without courts that work. You can't have courts that work if prosecutors can lie, cheat, hide evidence, and face no consequences. It all connects. Every piece depends on every other piece. And right now, we're testing whether the pieces still hold together. Now let me bring this back to something practical. What should you do if you're an investor watching all this unfold? What should you do if you're a business owner trying to plan for the future? What should you do if you're just someone trying to make sense of the chaos? First, don't panic. Panic is expensive. Panic makes you sell good assets at bad prices. Panic makes you miss opportunities while you're frozen in fear. The American economy has survived worse than one corrupt prosecution. It's survived wars, depressions, multiple political scandals. It will survive this too, one way or another. Second, focus on fundamentals. Companies that make real products, provide real services, earn real profits. Those companies don't stop functioning because Washington's a mess. People still need to eat, drive, get medical care, communicate, insure their property. The basics of economic life continue regardless of political drama. Third, stay liquid enough to sleep well. You don't want to be forced to sell in a panic because you ran out of cash. Keep reserves. Stay flexible. Don't over-leverage yourself based on assumptions about political stability. Fourth, and this is important, stay engaged as a citizen. Your portfolio's value depends on the health of the country. You can't separate the two. So vote. Pay attention. Hold leaders accountable. Demand integrity from the people running institutions. Don't let partisan loyalty blind you to corruption. The health of democracy isn't someone else's problem. It's your problem. It affects your wallet whether you want to admit it or not. Markets are watching this case. They're watching how institutions respond to stress. They're watching whether accountability still means something. They're pricing in political risk quietly, subtly, in ways that won't make headlines but will affect returns over time. The question is whether that risk premium grows or shrinks from here. If the Comey case gets dismissed, if prosecutors face consequences for their misconduct, if the Justice Department acknowledges problems and implements reforms, the risk premium shrinks. Markets will see that the system can correct itself, that corruption gets exposed and punished, that courts still function as intended. That's good for confidence, good for investment, good for long-term economic health. But if the case somehow survives despite the misconduct, if prosecutors face no consequences, if Trump succeeds in framing judicial oversight as deep state conspiracy, the risk premium grows. Markets will see that rules can be bent for political purposes, that corruption might be tolerated if it serves the right political goals, that courts might not always protect defendants from government abuse. That's bad for confidence, bad for investment, bad for long-term economic health. So this one case in one courthouse in Virginia matters more than it might seem. It's a signal, a test, a measure of institutional strength. And the markets are watching, even if they're not broadcasting it on CNBC. Let me tell you one more thing before we wrap this up. Something I've learned over decades of watching markets and politics interact. The biggest risks aren't the ones that make headlines. The biggest risks are the ones that erode quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day you look around and realize the foundation has crumbled. Corruption works that way. It doesn't announce itself with a crash. It seeps in. One compromised prosecutor here, one ignored ethical violation there, one judge who looks the other way to avoid political heat. Each instance seems small. Each one can be rationalized, but they accumulate, and eventually you wake up in a country where the rule of law is a suggestion, where justice depends on who you know and who you've angered, where power protects itself at the expense of everything else. That's the slow-motion disaster we need to avoid, and avoiding it requires vigilance, requires people like Judge Fitzpatrick who are willing to call out misconduct even when it's uncomfortable, requires defense lawyers who fight hard for their clients even when those clients are unpopular, requires journalists who dig into stories even when the powerful don't want them told, requires voters who demand integrity even from leaders they generally support. It requires all of us to care more about principles than personalities, more about systems than short-term victories, more about the long-term health of institutions than immediate partisan satisfaction. The Comey prosecution is failing. It's collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. And that's good. That's the system working. That's accountability happening in real time. Judge Fitzpatrick didn't protect James Comey. He protected the justice system from prosecutors who were willing to destroy it for political purposes. Trump's meltdown, his attacks on the judge, his claims of conspiracy, they tell you everything you need to know about who's really threatened by this ruling. It's not the deep state, it's Trump himself. Because what Judge Fitzpatrick exposed isn't a plot against Trump. It's a plot by Trump. A plot to use federal law enforcement as a weapon. A plot that required prosecutors willing to cut corners, hide evidence, and violate constitutional rights. That plot just failed, publicly, documented in court filings that will exist forever. And now Trump's scrambling to spin it as someone else's corruption rather than his own. But the facts don't spin. The misconduct is documented. The missing transcripts, the violated privileges, the grand jury that never approved the charges. That's all real. That all happened. And a federal judge saw it clearly enough to risk presidential wrath by calling it out. That judge deserves respect, not because he saved James Comey, but because he saved something more important. He saved the principle that prosecutions have to be built on evidence and law, not political pressure and ethical shortcuts. He saved the principle that courts exist to check government power, not rubber stamp it. He saved the principle that no one, not even the president, can corrupt the justice system without consequences. Those principles are worth more than any single case. They're worth more than any political victory. They're worth protecting, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. So as we watch this play out over coming weeks and months, as more evidence comes to light, as the case moves toward dismissal or trial, remember what's really at stake. Not just one prosecution, not just one defendant, but the integrity of the system that makes everything else possible. The economy you invest in, the businesses you build, the contracts you sign, the property you own, the rights you exercise, all of it depends on rule of law. All of it depends on courts that work. All of it depends on principles that outlast individual leaders. Judge Fitzpatrick just reminded us that those principles are still alive, still enforceable, still strong enough to stop corruption when someone has the courage to stand up and call it what it is. That's worth paying attention to. That's worth supporting. That's worth protecting. Because without it, everything else we care about eventually crumbles into dust.